3. Second marriage and other children. Having got his 4-year-old Mitya off his hands, Karamazov very soon married a second time. His second marriage lasted 8 years. He took his second wife, Sophia Ivanova, who was also a very young woman, from another province, where he had gone on some small contracting business with some Jew as his partner. Though Karamazov drank and led a disorderly and debauched life, he never neglected investing his capital and was always successful in managing his affairs, though of course almost always in a rather mean and shabby way. Sophia was an orphan child, the daughter of some obscure deacon, who had been left without relations since her early childhood. She grew up in the wealthy house of her benefactress, her instructor, and her tormentor, an aristocratic lady, the widow of a General Vorokhov. I do not know the details. I have only heard that the poor adopted girl, a meek, inoffensive, gentle creature, was once cut down after she had attempted to hang herself from a nail in a box room. So hard did she find it to put up with the caprices and constant reproofs of this apparently far from ill-natured old woman, who had become an insufferable, mean, and tyrannical woman through sheer idleness. Karamazov made her a proposal of marriage. Inquiries were made about him, and he was sent packing. And it was then that, as in his first marriage, he suggested an elopement to the orphan girl. It is very likely that she too would not have married him for anything in the world, if she had found out a little more about him in good time. But it all happened in another province, and besides, what could a 16-year-old girl be expected to know, except perhaps that she'd sooner throw herself into the river than remain with her benefactress? But it all happened in another province, and besides, what could a 16-year-old girl be expected to know, except perhaps that she'd sooner throw herself into the river than remain with her benefactress? So it was that the poor girl exchanged a benefactress for a benefactor. This time, Karamazov did not get a penny, for the general's widow was furious, gave them nothing, and would have nothing more to do with them. But he had not counted on getting anything. He was greatly attracted by the remarkable beauty of the innocent girl, and chiefly by her air of innocence, which made a powerful impression on a voluptuary like him, who till then had been a deprived admirer of only the coarser kind of feminine beauty. Those sweet, innocent eyes cut my heart like a knife at the time, he used to say afterwards, sniggering loathsomely, as was his wont. However, in such a lecherous man, that too might have been only a sensual attraction. Having taken her without any money, he did not stand on ceremony with her, and taking advantage of the fact that she was, as it were, guilty towards him, and that he had practically cut her down, as well as of her phenomenal meekness and lamb-like timidity, he did not hesitate to trample on the ordinary decencies of married life. Women of the streets used to come to his house while his wife was there, and they would have wild parties to show what actually used to happen. I may mention that the servant, Grigory Kutuzov, a gloomy, stupid, and obstinate moralist, who had hated his former mistress, this time took his new mistress's side, defended her, and quarrelled with Karamazov because of her in a manner that was hardly permissible from a servant. And one day he even broke up the party and threw all the hussies out of the house. Later on, the unhappy young woman, terrorized since her childhood, contracted one of those women's nervous diseases which are most often found in the country among village women, who are called shriekers because of it. This illness, accompanied as it was by terrible fits of hysteria, at times deprived her of her reason. Yet she bore Karamazov 2 sons, Ivan and Alexei, the first in the first year of marriage, and the second 3 years later. When she died, little Alexei was in his 4th year, and though it may seem strange, I know that he remembered his money. I know that he remembered his mother all his life, but of course, as though in a dream, after I know that he remembered his mother all his life, but of course, as though in a dream. After her death, almost exactly the same thing happened to the 2 boys as to their eldest brother, Mitya. They were completely forgotten and abandoned by their father, and found themselves in the charge of the same Grigory, and they also lived in his cottage. It was there that they were found by the tyrannical old widow of the general who had brought up their mother. She was still alive, and all that time, all those 8 years, could not forget the injury done her. About her, Sophia's mode of life during those 8 years, she had the most exact information from confidential sources, and learning how ill she was, and in what hideous surroundings she lived, she decided aloud to her poor relations, "It serves her right. It's God's punishment on her for her ingratitude." Exactly 3 months after Sophia's death, the old lady made an appearance in our town, and went straight to Karamazov's house. She only stayed about half an hour in our town, but she did a great deal. It was in the evening. Karamazov, whom she had not seen during all those 8 years, came out to her drunk. It is said that as soon as she saw him, she instantly, without any more ado, slapped his face twice with all the force at her command, and pulled him up and down 3 times by the tuft of his hair. Then, without another word, she went straight to the 2 boys at the cottage. Noticing at the first glance that they were unwashed and that their linen was dirty, she promptly slapped Gregory's face too, told him that she was taking them away with her. She took them out of the cottage just as they were, wrapped a rug around them, put them into her carriage, and carried them off to her town. Grigory bore the blow like a devoted slave, without uttering a rude word to her. When he saw the old lady off to the carriage, he bowed low to her, saying impressively that God would reward her for looking after the orphans. "You're an oaf for all that," the general's widow shouted to him as she drove away. Thinking it over, Karamazov came to the conclusion that it was a good thing, and did not afterwards refuse his formal consent on any point of his children's being educated by the general's widow. As for the slaps she had given him, he himself spread the story all over town. It so happened that soon after this the general's widow, too, died, but in her will she left the boys 1,000 rubles each for their education, stipulating, however, that while all that money should be spent on them, it should be made to last until they came of age, because even so small a sum was too much for such children. But if anyone felt more generous, let him give more, and so on. I have not read the will myself, but I heard that there was something queer of this sort, and that it was rather eccentrically expressed. The principal heir of the old lady, Yefim Petrovitch Polanov, marshal of nobility of the province, however, turned out to be an honest man. After an exchange of letters with Karamazov, he realized at once that he could extract no money from him for the education of his children, though Karamazov never directly refused, but always kept putting off in such cases, sometimes indeed becoming effusively sentimental. He therefore took a personal interest in the orphan children and became particularly fond of the younger, Alexei, so much so that the boy lived at his house for a long time and grew up as a member of the family. I should like to ask the reader to note this from the very beginning, and if the young people were indebted for their bringing and education to any man, that man was Mr. Polanov, one of the most honorable and humane men one is ever likely to meet. He kept the 1,000 rubles the general's widow had left each of the two boys intact, so that by the time they came of age it had doubled by the accumulation of interest. He educated them at his own expense, and needless to say, spent far more than 1,000 of each of them. For the time being, I shall again not enter into the detailed description of their boyhood and adolescence, but will merely indicate a few of the more important circumstances. Of the elder, Ivan, however, I will only say that he grew into a rather morose young man, who was always withdrawn into himself. He was far from timid, but it seems that already by the age of 10 he had become aware that they were living among strangers and on other people's charity, that their father was a man of whom one ought to be ashamed to talk, and so on. This boy began to show very early, almost in infancy, so at least it was said, quite an extraordinarily brilliant aptitude for learning. I don't know all the particulars, but for some reason or other he left Yefim Polanov's family when he was barely 13, entered a Moscow secondary school, boarding at the house of an experienced and famous pedagogue, a childhood friend of Polanov's. Ivan himself used to declare afterwards that it all happened because of the enthusiasm for good works of Polanov, who was carried away by the idea that a boy of such brilliant abilities had to be educated by a brilliant tutor. However, neither Polanov nor the brilliant tutor was living when, after finishing school, the young man entered the university. As As Polanov had failed to make the necessary provisions for the two boys, and as owing to the unavoidable formalities and delays so customary in Russia, the money they had inherited from the general's widow, which had increased from 1 to 2,000 rubles, had not been immediately available. The young man was very hard up indeed during his first 2 years at the university, and was forced to earn his own living all that time, as well as carry on with his studies. It should be noted that at the time he did not even attempt to enter into a correspondence with his father, perhaps out of pride, out of contempt for him, and perhaps, too, out of the common-sense reflection which told him that he would never obtain any real assistance, however small, from his father. Be that as it may, the young man was not in any way discouraged, and in spite of everything succeeded in getting work, at first by giving lessons at 6 pence an hour, and then by selling short stories of street incidents to different newspapers, under the signature of eyewitnesses. These stories, it was said, were always so interestingly and pungently written that they were soon in great demand, and in this respect alone the young man showed his practical and intellectual superiority over that large, indigent, and unhappy section of our students of both sexes who live from hand to mouth, and who in our capital cities are always in and out of the editorial offices of different newspapers and journals, unable to think of anything better than the constant repetition of one and the same request for translations from the French or for copying out articles. Having got an entry into the editorial offices, Ivan never lost touch with them, and during his last years at the university he began to publish brilliant reviews of books on various specialized subjects, so that he became well known even in literary circles. It was, however, only quite recently that he happened to have suddenly succeeded in attracting the special attention of a much wider public, so that a rather large number of people at once noticed and remembered him. That was a rather interesting incident. Having graduated from the university and preparing to leave for abroad on his 2,000 rubles, Ivan published in one of the leading newspapers a strange article which attracted the attention even of non-specialists, and, what was so extraordinary, on a subject on which he was apparently not an expert, since he had taken his degree in natural sciences. The article dealt with the question of ecclesiastical courts, which was being widely debated at the time. After discussing several opinions which had already been published on the subject, he went on to express his own view. What was so striking about his article was its tone and its extraordinarily surprising conclusion. And yet many churchmen were convinced that its author was on their side, but quite unexpectedly, not only secularists, but even atheists expressed their agreement with his views. In the end, several shrewd persons decided that the whole thing was nothing but an impertinent practical joke. I mention this incident especially because this article eventually found its way into our famous monastery, where they were greatly interested in the question of ecclesiastical courts, which had arisen just then, and having found its way there, it produced general bewilderment. On learning the name of the author, they were also interested in the fact that he was a native of our town and the son of that Karamazov. And just then the author himself made a sudden appearance among us. Why Ivan Karamazov had arrived in our town just then was a question that I remember rather worried me at the time. This so fateful visit, which led to so many consequences, remained a mystery to me long afterwards, and indeed almost always. In view of everything, it seems strange that a young man so learned, so proud, and seemingly so cautious should suddenly take up his residence in so disreputable a house, and with a father who had ignored him all his life, who neither knew nor remembered him, who, if his son had ever asked him for money, would never have given him any under any circumstances, for he was always afraid that his sons Ivan and Alexei might one day come and ask him for money. And now the young man took up residence in the house of such a father, lived with him for 1 month, and then for another, and both of them seemed to be getting on marvelously together. This last fact seemed particularly astonishing, not only to me, but to many others. Peter Miusov, of whom I have already spoken, a distant relative of Fyodor Karamazov, by his first marriage, happened just then to be spending some time on his estate in the vicinity of our town, having arrived from Paris, where he had settled permanently. I remember that it was he who was most of all impressed when he had made the acquaintance of the young man. Ivan interested him exceedingly, and he sometimes engaged, not without inner pangs, in furious intellectual arguments with him. "He's proud," he used to say to us at the time about him. "He'll always be able to earn his living. He has money even now. He can afford to go abroad. So what is he after here? Everyone can see that he hasn't come to his father for money, for his father would never give him any. He doesn't like drinking and whoring, and yet the old man can't do without them. So well are they getting on together." And it was true. The young man's influence over his father was quite evident. The old man seemed even to obey him at times, though occasionally he still was extremely and even maliciously perverse. Sometimes he even began to behave more decently. It only became known afterwards that one of the reasons for Ivan's arrival was that his elder brother, Mitya, had asked him to intercede with their father on his behalf. Ivan had met his brother for the first time almost at the same time, and during that very visit, but before his arrival from Moscow, he had entered into correspondence with him about an important matter that concerned Mitya more than himself. What it was, the reader will learn in full detail in due course. All the same, even when I found out what this special business was, Ivan still seemed an enigmatic figure to me, and his arrival in our towns remained a mystery. I may add here that Ivan was at the time trying to meditate between his father and his elder brother, who was just then at daggers drawn with his father, and even instituted formal legal proceedings against him. That family, I repeat, met for the first time just then, and some of its members saw each other for the first time in their lives. Only the youngest son, Alexei, had lived in our town for the past year, and had thus arrived there before his brothers. It is about Alexei that I find it most difficult to speak in this introductory story before bringing him onto the stage in my novel. But I'm afraid I shall have to give some preliminary description of him, too, to explain at least one very strange fact, namely, the fact that I am forced to introduce my future hero to the reader in the very first scene of my novel, wearing a cassock of a novice. Yes, indeed, he had been living for the past year in our monastery, and was apparently getting ready to take his vows and to spend the rest of his life there.